Hi everyone. So today in this video we're going to have a look at how we can use static properties in our mono behaviors to do some interesting stuff like keeping track of number of game objects and a list of all the game objects for a particular type. We're also going to take a look at prefabs and prefab variants. So let's dive in. So we're going to be continuing on from the last video where we created a really simple rocket behavior. So I went through the whole kind of process I take when designing a mono behavior. So we had this super simple behavior. Just get this so you can see it, where we just have a rocket that it wakes up, gets its rigid body, it applies a forward force, and it keeps going until it runs out of fuel. So if I run this, you'll be able to see it work. So there it goes, off it goes. So what we did actually is all we did was I had an asset from the asset store, which is connector. So I found this rocket and just attached that script to this rocket with a rigid body. Now this actually itself is a prefab. So we can, in the editor, I made a few of these variables. These variables, I added this serialized field annotation to the to it, which means we can edit those in the actual editor. And what we want to do is, in most games, you're going to want to actually create more than one object. So we use something called prefabs. So if I'm going to create a new folder in my assets folder called prefabs. And a prefab really is kind of like a set of, it's a game object with a certain set of components and values. So for example, we've got this atom rocket here, and it's got a rigid body. Every game object has a transform, and it's got this rocket engine behavior. Now in the asset that I downloaded from the asset store, it actually came with a prefab for this rocket itself. So if I actually open this prefab up, you can see, so what I did, clicked on Atom Robot, opened it up, and then I've got this prefab that is the rocket with all of its mesh components in here. And then I just dragged that into the scene. And if I come back out of this, I dragged it into the scene, and that gave me a copy or a clone of that prefab. And then I added a rigid body and a rocket engine behavior, which are the two things that we wanted to add to actually make this thing move. And if you look here, you can see that there's this kind of blue highlight. And what that's telling us is it's telling us that we've changed the prefab. And this prefab is different to the one in our asset folder. And actually, if we were to click on this overrides button here, it would give us a list. You won't be able to see these off the screen, but don't worry. It would give us it gives us a list of everything that's different. And it's everything that's got this little plus on it. Now I actually want to store a version of this prefab, and so I'm just going to drag this prefab into the prefabs folder. And then what it asks me is, it says, would you like to create a new original prefab or a variant of this prefab? Now prefab variants is something that was introduced, I think, in Unity 2019, which is super useful. You can almost think about it like a class inheritance type structure. So what we can do, Unity knows that this atom rocket is a prefab, and we've made some changes to it. And when I've dragged this into the folder, it's like, well, okay, do you want to retain that link to the original prefab? In which case you'd make a prefab variant, and then any changes we made to that original prefab would be reflected in all our variants of that. So I'm going to actually, in this case, create an original prefab. So now you'll see that this has changed to this kind of blue icon here, which if I click on it twice, I can rename it to Rocket. And then I'll rename this one to Rocket as well. And I can actually delete this rocket now. And if I drag this into the scene, I can drag a few rockets in. And if I click play, they're all going to behave. You see, they're all kind of like going off, flying off together. Now, what if I wanted some of these rockets to be slightly different? So let's say I'm going to delete this rocket. I'm going to call this one Super Rocket. And this one is going to have, let's say, it's going to burn twice as long, and it's going to have twice the thrust. Interestingly, something I discovered, I kind of more recently, if I, and something else, a little tip, if I right click on this thrust thing, you can see it's gone blue because I've changed the value from the prefab value. And right click on it and click revert, and it takes it back to what it was before. So if I know I want to double this, maybe I'm balancing a game and I kind of just know I want to double a number or change it by a certain amount, you can just type in maths into these boxes and it works. So if I did the times 2, it multiplied it by 2. So now if we play this, we'll notice one of the rockets shoots off much faster than the other one, right? And then what I can do is I can drag this super rocket in, and in this case, I'm going to create a prefab variant. So then we've got these, we've got the base rocket here, which is the original one that we created with all these original values. And then we've got the prefab variant here, which has the thrust and the burn time changed. And what's really useful about this is let's say we're developing and a designer says, well, everything with the rockets are fine, but it needs to have a bit more mass when it runs out of fuel. Well, then this is really easy for us just to change in the child prefab. I can just change the mass to 20. You can see that's been reflected then in the variant, and it has been reflected in our games, in our objects in the scene. And like, we probably won't have much difference with that change because that's only going to affect it towards the end of the flight. So that was a kind of a crash course in prefabs and prefab variants. Now, with most games, like I would almost say all games, maybe not all games, you will probably be creating objects as the game is running. So like this game is running now and I can just drop in as many of these as I want. They just keep getting added. Now there are lots and lots of cases where somewhere in your code you might want to keep track of how many of these rockets you've got. And maybe you want to have some kind of power up that destroys all the rockets or finds all the rockets or something like that. You can imagine all sorts of cases where you need to do that. And like many things, there's lots of different ways you could do it. But I'm going to show you how we can use static properties to help us achieve this kind of thing. So, because if this is the first time you've come to, and watched one of these, the idea is that I want to try and talk about kind of more software design. And so this is like a feature in C#, a feature in most programming languages, object-oriented programming languages, which we can use, which a lot of people forget that you can do in Unity, because I think it's very common for people to forget that we're still just working with classes. Like we kind of add this monobehavior thing on here, and you kind of forget you can still do all the same stuff that you could do with any normal class. So we're going to start simple. Let's say we want to keep track of the total number of rockets that exist in the scene at any one time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define a public, well, no, okay, yes, I'm going to do a public static integer, which is number of rockets. And I'm going to set that to 0. Okay, so it's going to start as 0. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, so this is basically the number that I want to increase every time we have a rocket added, and I want it to decrease every time a rocket is removed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use two functions that are part of the monoBehavior class that we haven't used before. So I'm going to use onEnable. And onEnable is called when an object is created, when a game object is created and enabled. So in onEnable, we're going to do number of rockets plus, and then I'm going to do onDisable, which is the opposite. So when we get rid of this game object, I'm going to do number of rockets minus. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a static is, what you can think about this as being as this variable, if we're saying it's static, we're saying this variable is part of the class itself, but not part of a single instance of that class. So what that means is that we can access this from any, this is the same for all Rocket Engine behaviors. It just exists as part of Rocket Engine behavior. It doesn't exist in any particular rocket. So if I save this and go back to the editor, you'll notice that it hasn't appeared here in the editor for us to edit, because it wouldn't make sense, because it doesn't exist in each instance. It exists kind of almost globally as this static, this int. It's something that we don't have to instantiate one of these classes. We don't have to create an object of this type for this to exist. It exists anyway. We could have no rockets, but this still exists. This will have a value and we can access it. So we want to check this is working. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm actually going to create another class to do the debug, because right, so I'm going to go to my scripts and behaviors, create a C# class and call it rocket tester behavior. And then I'm just going to use the rocket tester behavior. I'm going to, in the fixed update, actually what I might do is I might do, let's do private void rocket debug. And then what this is going to do is going to do a debug.log. I'm going to say number of rockets equals plus, and then I'm going to get this rocket engine behavior. And if you notice now, I'm going to have the number of rockets, and I'm going to do a toString to convert it to a string, and this will appear in the debug window. At the moment, this isn't being fired by anything. So what I'm going to do is in this start, I'm going to do an invoke repeating, which what this does is it takes a method name. I'm going to say rocket debug. How long until the first time you want this to start? I want it to start straight away. And I want it to every half a second. What this will do, it will call this rocket debug every half a second. So I need to attach that to a game object. Create an empty object, 0, 0. Whenever you have these game objects that tend to be like more manager, like classes that don't necessarily have behavior or like a physical presence, I always put the transform at 0, 0. It just keeps things a bit tidy. And I call it rocket debug. Should call it rocket tester, really. Be consistent. So I'm getting the console up, and if I click play, you should see number of rockets equals 2. If in another rocket, go to my scene, rockets equals 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then it's sticking on 5. So you can see it's with the debug console, something to be aware of is if the same message is displayed more than once, it just tells you how many times it's being displayed. I don't actually know if I No, so if I delete this, I wonder if that will. So the on disable is something for testing. We can't unplay this. So we haven't actually tested this on disable method because the on disable method is only called when these game objects are destroyed using the Unity engine. So to test that, we'll need something to destroy some rockets. And I'm going to introduce that by showing you something else you can do with static properties. Because we can also have static methods. So as well as this static property that anywhere we can get, you could imagine having your UI could look at that. I mean, you'd actually do an event or something. We'll do that another time. But you can imagine all sorts of situations where it would be useful to get a total number of rockets. Now, what if we wanted to, say, destroy a random rocket? Well, let's create a static method to do that. So I'm going to put it at the top, say public, because we don't mind any, and we want any class to be able to do this. Static void, and let's say destroy random rocket. So what we want this to do is that when this is called from anywhere, then we want one of the rockets that exists to get destroyed. So to do that, we need a list of all the rockets. Now we could do something, and a lot of people do this kind of thing, that is where we could maybe tag the rocket and search for all game objects with a certain tag. We could put the rocket on a layer and search for all the game objects on a layer or something. We could search for all entities that have the rocket engine behavior. But all of these things, like those kind of searches, are quite costly. And so if you end up calling this destroy random rocket a lot, maybe it's a power up that happens, or that's too expensive. Ideally, we want that list to just be maintained only when rockets are created and destroyed. So what we can do is we can actually have a public, I'm actually going to say private. We don't need this one. We don't need other classes to be able to see this one. Private, let's say, so we want a private static list of rocket engine behavior. I'm going to call this all rockets equals new. So this is a generic list, and it stores with a list of values, storing a list of rocket engine behaviors. So now what we can do is we can, when this gets created, all rockets dot add this. So we'll add this to the list when it's created and remove it when it's destroyed. And then to destroy a random rocket, we just need to get a random rocket and destroy it. So we can do, well, firstly, what we need to do is check if there's rockets. Yeah, so if all rockets dot count equals 0, return. And what I might do is I'm gonna make this actually return a bool. I'm gonna return false. And what that means is that we called that function, it didn't actually destroy a rocket. And you might need that because let's say you have something that destroys a random rocket and the player gets points for that. You'd want to know if a rocket had actually been destroyed. So if we're here, we know we've got more rockets. So we can do all rockets random dot range. And this is going to be between 0 and all rockets dot count. And if you remember from the video on sprites that we did, then I can just put the count in here because random range doesn't, when you're using an int, it doesn't include the biggest value here, so that won't give us an error. And then we want to destroy this, so we're going to do gameObject. So actually what we want to do is we want to do destroy like that. And then we return true because we've destroyed that. And that should be, and that's fine. That should work. Now, something I realized that we could also do here as I was typing this is that actually now we've got this list, we don't really need this int here because the number of rockets is just all rockets.count. So instead of having that, what we can do, well, actually we could do, so now we want public int, so public static int number of rockets. And then we're just going to return, all rockets count. We can also, interestingly, what we can do with C# is this method, all it does is return an int. So we can actually, there's this syntactic sugar where I can replace this with a property because it's not really a method, it's a property. So now I'm returning number of ints. I'm just saying this is an int, number of rockets, which is all rockets.count. So we're pointing that to that value. And then what that means is I don't have to actually change this code. So first let's check that that change worked. So I'm going to play and hopefully this would say 2. Yep, it says 2. And if I add another one, 15, 3, 4. Okay. So now what I want to do, I'm going to add a whole load of rockets. Okay. I've added 2. I'm going to add a whole bunch of rockets. So we've got loads. And actually, I'm going to just those like that. So we've got plenty of rockets. Let's see how many we've got. 20. And now in my debugger, my testing script that I made, I'm going to add a new one. Void test. Let's say call this test destroyer. Test random destroy. I'm going to do debug.log. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say destroy test. And I'm going to say before number rockets equals to this. And then I'm going to actually call the destroy thing. So we want rocket engine behavior dot destroy random rocket. And actually I will also say debug.log for destroy, because remember we made this output a bool, didn't we? I might not like that. Let's do bool did destroy equals that. I need the toString. Okay, and then I'm going to do did destroy, so plus did destroy dot toString like that, and then we're going to debug print what the number is afterwards. So we'll be able to see if our counting is working. So I'm going to leave that running every half second, and then we're going to do a test random destroy every second. I'm going to start that in like 0.7 let's say 5. I can actually say 4 seconds so they don't happen at the same time. That could confuse things. So this is how I'm testing those 2 static functions. So let's have a look. Play this. Okay. So I'm going to click pause. So here we go. So what have we got here? We've got number of rockets 17. You can see the number has been going down. Let's go from the start. Okay. So number of rockets is 20. Destroy test before number of rockets equals 20. Call destroy true, number of rockets equals 19. So there we go. It's totally working. If I unpause this, and let's let it go down to 0. And we should get a false then on the call. It shouldn't give us a bug, right? So we shouldn't get any kind of null error because we did checks for so there we go, got 0, false. And then you can see it's repeating this. And so that's kind of what I mean by that's also because this is static. Like even though we have no rockets in the scene, rockets don't exist anywhere. It's these values and the list of rockets that were there exist, and they were completely maintained. And they were all maintained like at the only point they needed to be, when a rocket is destroyed or added. And that's a really powerful. Once you start to understand like static methods and properties, they're incredibly useful. You do need to be careful of like scope and making sure that that you've set up that there are some dangers with having these public lists. If we were made like this, I've made it private. If it was public, it would be possible to add a rocket to this list somewhere else in our code that isn't here. And that means that that's how you get introduced, like bugs being introduced, that maybe someone doesn't realize you're not meant to do that. They add a rocket to that list, or they take a rocket away without it being taken away on disable. And then that's how you start losing track of what the real count is. You can also use this for things like object pooling. Sometimes it's a good idea to have an object pool per like type of object that you've got, and that's a way to do it with static objects. But yeah, that's static. That's this in a nutshell. How to use static properties and the static keyword really to your advantage in C# and Unity. Thanks for watching.